I always believed that family was supposed to protect you. I was wrong. My sister's fingers twisted into my hair like claws. Before I could scream, she slammed my head into the wall. The crack echoed through the empty hallway. Pain exploded behind my eyes, white hot, blinding. I crumpled to the floor, my cheek pressed against the cold, hardwood blood, warm and wet against my temple. Diane crouched down, her face inches from mine. Her perfume, the expensive one our parents bought her for Christmas, filled my lungs as she whispered, "You don't deserve anything. You never did." Then she stood up, smoothed her blouse, and walked away. Her heels clicked against the floor, steady and unhurried, as if she hadn't just left her sister bleeding and barely conscious. She thought no one would ever know. She thought she had won. But what Diane didn't realize was that someone was watching from the darkness. Someone who had promised our dying grandfather they would protect me. Someone who recorded everything. And when that person walked into the lawyer's office the next morning, everything satisfying begins with the truth finally being seen. My name is Angela Stewart. I'm 35 years old, and I work as a care coordinator at a senior center in Portland, Oregon. I've spent my career helping elderly patients navigate the most vulnerable chapters of their lives. I thought I understood loneliness. I thought I understood what it meant to feel invisible, but I didn't truly understand until I went home to bury my grandfather. The day I got promoted to manager, I called my mother to share the news. I was so excited my hands were shaking as I dialed. She answered on the fourth ring, her voice distracted. "That's nice, dear," she said, cutting me off mid-sentence. "Did you hear Diane just closed a huge deal? Your father and I are taking her to dinner this weekend to celebrate." She didn't ask about my promotion. She didn't say congratulations. The call lasted less than 2 minutes. I'm used to this. What I've never understood is why. For as long as I can remember, my family has treated me like a stranger they're obligated to tolerate. Missed calls that were never returned. Family gatherings I only learned about after they happened through photos posted on Facebook. Birthday cards I sent that were never acknowledged. I spent years wondering what I did wrong, what terrible thing I must have said or done to make my own parents look at me with such coldness in their eyes. My younger sister Diane has always been the star of our family. She's 32, beautiful, charming, successful in real estate. When she walks into a room, my parents light up like she's the sun itself. When I walk in, they glance at me, like they're checking whether a door was left open. 3 years ago, something strange happened. My grandfather called me at midnight, his voice shaking. "Angela," he said, "Diane told me you don't want to see me anymore. She said you think I'm a burden." My heart nearly stopped. I had never said anything like that. I loved my grandfather more than anyone in the world. "Grandpa, that's not true," I told him. "I would never say that. I love you." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I know, sweetheart. I know you. That's why I called." He never explained what made him doubt Diane's words, but something in his voice that night stayed with me. When Grandpa passed away, I drove home to help sort through his belongings. The house felt hollow without him. But what surprised me was the warmth I received from Martha, his elderly neighbor. She was the only person who seemed genuinely happy to see me. "Your grandfather talked about you all the time," Martha said, her kind eyes studying my face. "He said you were the only honest one in that family." She paused, and something sad flickered across her expression. "He asked me to keep an eye on you if anything ever happened. He was worried about something." I thanked her politely, but her words unsettled me in ways I couldn't explain. Inside the house, I noticed Diane acting strangely. She kept glancing toward Grandpa's office, where he kept important documents. Later, I caught her whispering to our mother in the kitchen. "I've handled everything," Diane said, her voice low and urgent. "She won't be a problem." Our mother nodded, looking relieved. I stood frozen in the hallway, my heart pounding. What were they talking about? That night I overheard Diane on the phone, her voice cold and confident. "The lawyer won't question anything. I've been preparing for this for months." Something was very wrong. I could feel it in my bones. That night, unable to sleep, I went to Grandpa's old cabinet to look for keepsakes. Behind a loose board at the back, I found an envelope, sealed, my name written on the front in Grandpa's shaky handwriting. I opened it with trembling hands. And what I read inside didn't just reveal the truth. It revealed that everything I believed about my family, about my entire life, was a lie. The letter was 3 pages long, written in Grandpa's shaky handwriting. The paper was thin, worn at the edges, as if he had held it many times before, finally hiding it away. I sat down on the cold floor of his office, my back against the cabinet, and I began to read. By the second paragraph, my hands were trembling so badly I could barely hold the pages steady. "Angela," he wrote, "I need you to know the truth before it's too late. For over 10 years, Diane has been poisoning this family against you. She told your mother that you said she was a bad parent, that you mocked her behind her back. She told your father that you were embarrassed by his job, that you told your friends he was just a factory worker. She told me that you didn't want to visit anymore, that you found me boring and old." I believed her at first. Your parents still believe her. But I started paying attention. I called you, and you always answered. Every single time. And there was love in your voice, Angela. Real love. Not the coldness Diane described. I watched Diane's face when she talked about you, and I saw something that chilled me. There was no sadness when she said you had abandoned us. There was satisfaction. She was enjoying it. I stopped reading. My chest felt tight, like someone was pressing down on my ribs. I forced myself to continue. 2 years ago, the letter went on. Diane came to me with a property transfer document. She said it was routine paperwork for the family trust. She asked me to sign it quickly because the bank was closing soon. Something felt wrong, so I pretended to sign it, but wrote my name slightly different than usual. When the bank reviewed it, they caught the discrepancy and called me. Angela, she had forged my signature on a version she created herself. She was trying to transfer the house into her name before I died. The bank rejected it and sent me the original document. I kept it as evidence. I never told your parents because I knew they wouldn't believe me. Diane has them wrapped around her finger so tightly they can't see straight. The final paragraph broke my heart. Angela, you are not the daughter who abandoned this family. You are the daughter who was erased. Diane did this to you, deliberately, systematically, for over a decade. And I am so sorry I didn't see it sooner. I am so sorry I believed her lies, even for a moment. You deserve better from all of us. I love you. I have always loved you. And I hope that one day the truth will set you free. Your grandfather, George. I sat there on that cold floor for a long time. The house was silent around me. But inside my head, everything was screaming. Every memory I had was reshaping itself, twisting into something new and terrible. The family dinners I wasn't invited to. The birthday calls that were never returned. The way my mother's voice always sounded strained when I called, like she was bracing herself for something unpleasant. The way my father couldn't meet my eyes at Grandpa's funeral. It wasn't because I had failed them. It wasn't because I wasn't good enough. It was because Diane had spent 10 years convincing them I was a monster. Every cruel thing she told them they believed. And not once, not a single time in all those years, did either of my parents pick up the phone and ask me if any of it was true. They just accepted Diane's version of me. They let her erase the real Angela and replace me with a villain in their minds. I wasn't the forgotten daughter. I was the deliberately destroyed daughter. And my own sister had done it with a smile on her face. The grief hit me first, then the anger. A deep burning anger that started in my stomach and spread through my whole body. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run upstairs and shake my parents awake and force them to read every word of this letter, but I knew that wouldn't work. Diane had spent a decade building her lies. She would find a way to explain this away, too. She would say Grandpa was confused, that his mind was going that I had somehow manipulated him into writing this. I needed to be smarter than that. I pulled out my phone with shaking hands. I photographed every page of the letter, front and back, making sure the images were clear and readable. Then I opened my email and composed a message to Mr. Harrison, Grandpa's lawyer. I found this letter tonight, hidden in my grandfather's belongings. I wrote, I believe you need to see it before tomorrow's reading. I also believe my sister may attempt to contest the will using false evidence. Please keep this confidential until the appropriate time. I will explain everything tomorrow. I attached the photos and pressed send. I didn't know if it would matter. I didn't know if anyone would believe me, but I refused to be erased anymore. If Diane wanted to destroy me, she was going to have to fight for it. I was still sitting on the floor clutching the letter when I heard footsteps on the stairs. Diane appeared in the doorway wearing silk pajamas, her hair perfect even at this hour. She had come down for water, but when she saw me sitting there with tears streaming down my face and papers in my hands, she froze. Her eyes locked onto the letter. I watched her expression shift in the space of a heartbeat. Surprise, then calculation, then cold, controlled fury. Give me that, she said. Her voice was calm, but I could hear the edge beneath it. Now. I stood up slowly, holding the letter behind my back. No. I know what you did, Diane. I know everything. The lies you told Mom and Dad, the things you said about me to Grandpa, the forged signature. I know all of it. Something flickered in her eyes. Fear, maybe. Or just annoyance that her perfect plan had a crack in it. Then she lunged at me. She grabbed my wrist and twisted it hard, trying to rip the letter from my grip. I held on with everything I had. Let go! She hissed, her nails digging into my skin. When I didn't release it, she changed tactics. She grabbed a fistful of my hair and slammed my head into the wall behind me. The crack echoed through the silent house. Pain exploded through my skull, white and blinding. My vision blurred. My knees buckled. I slid down the wall and crumpled onto the floor, unable to move, unable to think. Through the ringing in my ears, I felt her pull the letter from my weakened fingers. Diane crouched down next to me. Her face was inches from mine. I could smell her perfume, something expensive and floral. "You think anyone will believe you?" she whispered. Her voice was soft, almost tender, which made it worse. "I've spent 10 years making sure they don't. You're nothing, Angela. You've always been nothing. And after tomorrow, you won't even have Grandpa's money to make yourself feel better." She stood up, tucked the letter into the pocket of her pajamas, and walked away. Her footsteps faded up the stairs. She never looked back. What Diane didn't know was that the living room window was wide open because of the summer heat. What she didn't know was that Martha, unable to sleep, had walked over to check on the house. Martha had been standing in her own yard just feet from that window when she heard the shouting. She saw the struggle. She saw Diane slam my head into the wall. She saw her crouch down and whisper those terrible words. And with shaking hands, Martha had pulled out her phone and recorded the final moments of my sister's attack. She had the video now. And she had something else. She had the copy of the letter that Grandpa had given her months ago with instructions to use it only if Diane ever tried to hurt me. Diane walked away that night, believing she had destroyed the only evidence against her. She had no idea that 2 copies of that letter existed, and she had no idea that the woman who held them both was going to walk into that lawyer's office the next morning and burn her entire world to the ground. I barely slept that night. My head throbbed where it had struck the wall, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw Diane's face inches from mine, heard her whisper that I was nothing. When morning came, I forced myself out of bed, took a shower, and put on the most professional outfit I had brought with me. I looked at myself in the mirror. The bruise on my temple was already darkening, but I covered it as best I could with makeup. I had no letter anymore. Diane had taken it. But I had sent those photos to Mr. Harrison, and I had to believe that would be enough. I didn't know yet that Martha had already set something in motion that would change everything. 30 minutes before the will reading was scheduled to begin, Martha Collins walked into Harrison's law office. She was 73 years old, dressed in her best Sunday clothes, and she carried a sealed envelope that George had given her months before he died. Her hands trembled as she placed it on the lawyer's desk. "He told me to only open this if someone tried to hurt Angela," she said quietly. "Last night someone did." Harrison opened the envelope and read the letter inside. Martha watched his face grow grimmer with each page. When he finished, she pulled out her phone and showed him the video she had recorded through the open window. The room was silent, except for the sound of Diane's voice on the recording. Cruel and confident, saying those terrible words. Harrison was quiet for a long moment after the video ended. Then he picked up his phone and made a call. "I need you to delay the family's arrival by 15 minutes, he said. "There's something I need to prepare." When the Stewart family arrived at the law office that morning, Harrison was ready for us. I just didn't know it yet. The conference room felt small and airless. I sat alone on one side of the long table, my hands folded in my lap to hide the trembling. My head was still pounding, and every heartbeat sent a pulse of pain through my skull. Across from me sat Diane, positioned between our parents like a princess flanked by her loyal subjects. She looked perfect as always. Her hair was styled, her makeup flawless, her expression one of dignified grief. In her lap she held a leather folder, and I noticed her fingers kept touching it, as if reassuring herself it was still there. Our parents sat with their arms crossed, and when they looked at me, I saw something that cut deeper than any of Diane's words. I saw hostility. After everything, after all these years, they still believed her. They still looked at me like I was the enemy. "Mr." Harrison entered the room and took his seat at the head of the table. He was an older man, calm and measured. with the kind of face that revealed nothing. He shuffled some papers, cleared his throat, and began. I, George Edward Stewart, being of sound mind, declare this to be my last will and testament. I leave my home, my savings, and all my worldly possessions to my granddaughter Angela Marie Stewart. The silence that followed was absolute. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. Harrison continued, his voice steady. George added a personal note. He wrote Angela is the only person in this family who never came to me asking for anything. She is also the only one who never lied to me. Diane was on her feet before Harrison finished speaking. Her chair scraped back loudly against the floor. This is unacceptable, she said, her voice sharp and controlled. She opened her leather folder and pulled out a stack of papers. My grandfather was clearly manipulated in his final months. I have evidence right here. Emails from Angela demanding money, text messages where she threatened to abandon him unless he changed his will. I even have a handwritten note where she admits to pressuring him. She slapped the papers down on the table. This will needs to be contested. My grandfather wasn't in his right mind. I stared at the papers. Emails I never wrote. Text messages I never sent. A note in handwriting that looked like mine, but wasn't. She had fabricated everything. She had spent weeks, maybe months, building a case against me using lies and forgeries, and our parents were nodding along, believing every word. Harrison raised his hand calmly. Before you present your evidence, Ms. Stewart, I have something to share with the family. He reached into his briefcase and produced an envelope. This letter was written by George Stewart and entrusted to a third party with instructions to deliver it if anyone attempted to harm Angela or contest this will. And he opened the envelope and began to read aloud. I watched Diane's face as Harrison read Grandpa's words, the lies she had told over the years, the stories she invented to poison our parents against me, the forged property document from 2 years ago. With each sentence, Diane's composure cracked a little more. Her face went pale. Her hands gripped the edge of the table. George kept the original forgery as evidence of Diane's character, Harrison said. He anticipated that she might attempt to use fabricated evidence to contest his wishes. He looked directly at my sister. Would you still like to present the contents of your folder, Ms. Stewart? Diane's voice came out high and strained. That letter is fake. Angela must have made him write it. She manipulated him. She took advantage of a sick old man. She turned to our parents, desperate now. You believe me, don't you? You know I would never do any of this. I stood up slowly. My legs felt weak, but my voice was steady when I spoke. I didn't manipulate anyone. But last night, after I found Grandpa's letter, Diane attacked me. She slammed my head into the wall and stole the letter from my hands. She thought she destroyed the only copy. I looked toward the door. She was wrong. The door opened. Martha Collins walked in, dressed in her Sunday best, her face calm but determined. She was 73 years old and had been George's neighbor and closest friend for over 40 years. She walked to Harrison's desk and placed her phone down gently. I'm Martha Collins, she said, her voice clear and unwavering. George asked me to watch over Angela because he knew what was coming. Last night I saw exactly what his other granddaughter is capable of. Harrison connected the phone to the display screen on the wall. The video began to play. The room watched in frozen silence. There was Diane grabbing my hair. There was the moment she slammed my head into the wall. There was her face leaning close to mine as I lay crumpled on the floor. And there was her voice clear as day saying those words, "You're nothing, Angela. You've always been nothing." My mother let out a choked sob. My father stared at the floor, unable to watch. Diane stood paralyzed, her mouth open, no words coming out. Her folder of fabricated evidence sat forgotten on the table. Everything she had built, every lie she had told, every relationship she had poisoned, was collapsing around her in real time. I watched my sister and I felt something I hadn't expected. Not satisfaction, not triumph, just a deep, exhausted relief. For 35 years, I believed I was the problem. For 35 years, I wondered what was wrong with me that my own family couldn't love me. Now I knew the truth. It was never me. It was never me. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel invisible. I felt free. But the video was only the beginning of Diane's unraveling. When investigators finished examining her evidence folder, they discovered fabricated emails, doctored messages, and forged documents. Proof of a calculated fraud that would cost Diane far more than just an inheritance. Everything she had built was about to come crashing down. The days after the will reading blurred together in a haze of police interviews, lawyer meetings, and sleepless nights. I filed assault charges against Diane the morning after that terrible confrontation in Harrison's office. The video Martha had recorded was undeniable evidence. You could see everything clearly: the attack, the theft of the letter, those whispered words that still echoed in my head every time I closed my eyes. But what started as a simple assault case quickly became something much bigger. Investigators examined the contents of Diane's leather folder, the one she had planned to use to contest the will. Forensic experts traced the emails to an account Diane had created herself using a fake name. The text messages had been digitally altered, screenshots manipulated to change dates and words. The handwritten note that was supposed to be in my handwriting was analyzed by a document expert who confirmed it was a forgery. All of it was fabricated. Every single piece of evidence she planned to present was a lie she had carefully constructed over weeks, maybe months. The lead prosecutor called me into her office about 3 weeks after everything happened. She was a serious woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner. "This isn't a one-time mistake," she told me, sliding a thick folder across her desk. "Your sister has been committing fraud against your family for years. The assault charge is just the beginning." They also reviewed the property transfer document from 2 years ago, the one where Diane had forged Grandpa's signature. The statute of limitations prevented them from prosecuting that specific crime separately, but they used it to establish what they called a pattern of calculated deception. Diane wasn't just facing assault charges anymore. She was facing attempted fraud evidence tampering and potentially more charges as the investigation continued. The consequences came for Diane faster than anyone expected. Her real estate company fired her within a week of the video surfacing. Someone had leaked it online, and within days it had spread through local social media groups. Her employer called it reputational damage and terminated her contract immediately. Her boyfriend of 2 years, a successful architect she had been grooming as a potential husband, discovered the truth about our family. Diane had told him that I was the problem. She said I had stolen family jewelry when Grandpa got sick. She said I had abandoned him in his final months and only came back for the inheritance. When he learned the truth, when he saw the video and read about the forged documents, he ended the relationship immediately and blocked her number. Friends who once admired her confidence and success began to see her differently. One by one, they stopped returning her calls. The invitations to parties and dinners dried up. The woman who always had somewhere important to be suddenly had nowhere to go. She was forced to sell her luxury downtown apartment to pay her mounting legal fees. The last I heard, she was renting a small studio on the outskirts of the city waiting for her trial date. The woman who spent a decade making me invisible had become someone no one wanted to see. 2 weeks after the will reading, my mother called. Her voice was thick with tears, barely recognizable. "We didn't know Angela," she said. "Diane told us so many things over the years. She said you were angry at us, that you didn't want to be part of this family anymore. We believed her. We're so sorry." I listened in silence, letting her words wash over me. Part of me had waited 10 years to hear those words. Another part of me felt nothing but exhaustion. When she finished, I spoke. My voice was calm, but I didn't soften what I needed to say. "Mom, I called you every single month for 10 years. Every single month. And every time you sounded like you couldn't wait to hang up. Did you ever even once ask me if what Diane said was true?" Silence on the other end of the line. "Did you ever wonder why I would say those terrible things about you when I kept calling, kept trying to visit, kept sending birthday cards that were never acknowledged?" More silence. I continued. "I'm not angry at Diane anymore, Mom. She's sick. Something is broken inside her that I can't fix and don't want to understand. But I am angry at you and Dad." She lied yes. "But you chose to believe her without ever giving me a chance to defend myself. For 10 years. You never once picked up the phone and asked me for my side of the story. That's not Diane's fault. That's yours." I heard her crying softly, but I couldn't stop. "I need time away from this family. Please don't call me. When I'm ready, I'll reach out." I hung up before she could respond. I sat alone in my apartment for a long time after that call, staring at the wall, feeling the weight of 10 lost years pressing down on my chest. 3 weeks later, there was a knock on my apartment door. I opened it to find my father standing in the hallway. He looked like he had aged a decade since the will reading. His shoulders were slumped, his eyes red-rimmed, his hands trembling at his sides. He didn't ask to come in. He just stood there in the doorway and started speaking. "I've spent the last 3 weeks going through everything," he said, his voice rough and cracking. "Every phone record, every text message you sent that I never answered. Every time you reached out and I ignored you because Diane told me you had said something cruel about your mother." He paused, struggling to get the words out. "Your grandfather tried to tell me once about 2 years ago. He said Diane wasn't who we thought she was. He said something was wrong with her, that she was hurting you. I told him he was getting confused in his old age. I told him to stop stirring up trouble." Tears rolled down his weathered face, disappearing into the gray stubble on his chin. "I chose her word over his. My own father and I dismissed him like he was losing his mind." He looked at me, then really looked at me, maybe for the first time in years. "I could have picked up the phone any time in the last 10 years and just asked you if any of it was true. One phone call. That's all it would have taken, but I never did. I just believed what was easier to believe." His voice broke completely. "That's not Diane's fault, Angela. That's mine. I failed you. I failed my own daughter. And I will spend the rest of my life knowing that." He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't make excuses. He didn't try to explain or justify or minimize. He just stood there, an old man, broken by his own choices, telling me the truth I had waited 35 years to hear. I cried. Not because I forgave him. I wasn't sure if I could ever fully forgive either of my parents for what they had let Diane do to me. But I cried because for the first time in my life, someone in my family finally saw the truth without forcing me to fight for it. Someone finally believed me without needing a video or a letter or a lawyer to prove I wasn't the monster Diane had made me out to be. I told my father I needed time. He nodded and left without another word. I watched him walk down the hallway toward the elevator, his steps slow and heavy with regret. When I returned to Grandpa's house a few days later to begin sorting through his belongings, I climbed up to the attic to look through some old boxes. Behind a stack of dusty photo albums, I found something I hadn't expected: a wooden box with a note taped to the lid in Grandpa's shaky handwriting. It said simply, "For Angela, when you're ready." I opened it with trembling hands, and what I found inside took my breath away. It was filled with everything he couldn't say while he was alive, and it would finally heal the wounds my family had spent a decade inflicting. The wooden box was old and worn, the kind Grandpa used to make in his workshop when I was a little girl. I carried it downstairs and sat at his kitchen table, the same table where he used to make me hot chocolate on cold winter mornings. My hands trembled as I lifted the lid. Inside were dozens of letters, all addressed to me, none of them ever sent. I picked up the first one and began to read, and by the time I finished, I understood everything. 3 months passed between that moment in the attic and the day Diane finally faced her judgment. She accepted a plea deal to avoid a public trial that would have exposed every detail of her decade-long manipulation to the world. The criminal terms were severe but fair. 200 hours of community service, 2 years of probation, $30,000 in restitution to be paid directly to me, and mandatory psychological counseling for what the prosecutors described as pathological deceptive behavior. She stood in that courtroom looking smaller than I had ever seen her. Her designer clothes replaced by something plain and forgettable, her perfectly styled hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She didn't look at me once during the entire proceeding. Separately, the Oregon Real Estate Agency conducted its own review of her professional conduct, the fabricated documents, the fraud charges, the established pattern of deception spanning years. All of it disqualified her from holding a professional license in the state. Her real estate certification was permanently revoked. The career she had built, the success she had flaunted at every family gathering, the deals she closed that our parents celebrated, while ignoring my own quiet achievements, all of it was gone. With no career, no savings after the legal fees, no friends willing to associate with her, and no family member offering shelter, Diane had nowhere to go. She eventually relocated to a small town in Nebraska to live with a distant cousin she barely knew. I heard this through Martha, who still kept her ear to the ground even after everything was over. For the first time in her life, my sister had nothing. No audience to perform for, no family to manipulate, no sister to stand on to make herself feel taller. She would have to discover who she really was, when she could no longer define herself by being better than me. That was her true punishment. And perhaps if she ever truly changed, it might also be her only chance at redemption. But that was her journey now, not mine. I had my own life to rebuild. The letters in Grandpa's box became my most precious possession. There were letters about my college graduation. He wrote that he had driven 3 hours to watch me walk across the stage, sitting in the back row because he was afraid of causing a scene with my parents. He said he cried when they called my name. There were letters about my first job at the senior center. Martha had told him about it, and he wrote that he was so proud he couldn't sleep that night. There were letters about the charity drive I organized for homeless veterans 2 years ago, something I never told anyone about. He had seen my photo in the local newspaper and cut it out. He kept it in his wallet. One letter dated 5 years ago made me cry so hard I couldn't breathe. He wrote, "Diane told your parents you were ashamed of this family and wanted nothing to do with us, but I saw you wearing your grandmother's necklace in every photo Martha showed me. I knew the truth, Angela. A daughter who hated her family wouldn't wear her grandmother's necklace over her heart. I always knew." Another letter written just months before he died said, "You don't need them to see you, sweetheart. I see you. I have always seen you, and I am so proud of the woman you've become. Not despite your family, but in spite of them. That takes a strength most people will never understand." I decided to keep Grandpa's house, not to live in, but as a sanctuary I could return to whenever the world felt too heavy. I spent my weekends restoring it slowly the way he would have wanted. I repainted the porch he loved, choosing the same shade of blue he had used for as long as I could remember. I planted flowers in the garden he used to tend the same varieties he always chose. I hung his photos in frames throughout the rooms, filling the house with memories of the man who never stopped believing in me. I also established something I called the George Stewart Foundation. It was a scholarship fund for young people who had been overlooked, dismissed, or isolated by their families, but continued to persevere anyway. The first recipient was a young woman from rural Oregon whose story mirrored my own in so many ways. She was the unfavored child, the one blamed for everything, the one who succeeded despite being told she never would. When I handed her that scholarship check, she cried and hugged me and said no one had ever believed in her before. I told her that someone always had. She just hadn't met them yet. With my parents, I set clear and firm terms. I would allow limited contact, but only when I initiated it, only in public places, and never if they mentioned Diane or made excuses for her behavior. Our first meeting was at a coffee shop downtown Neutral Territory where I felt safe. My mother looked fragile, older than I remembered, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea she never drank. My father sat stiff and silent, his eyes red from what I suspected were many sleepless nights. I told them exactly where I stood. "You don't get credit for finally believing me," I said. "You get the chance to prove you've changed. That chance can be revoked at any time. Do you understand?" My mother nodded, tears streaming down her face. My father simply said, "We understand. We'll earn it." Whether they actually would remain to be seen. But for the first time in my life, the terms were mine to set. On a warm September evening, I stood on the porch of Grandpa's house, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. The old oak tree he planted the year I was born stretched its branches toward the fading light, leaves rustling in the gentle breeze. I held the last letter from the box dated just 2 weeks before he died, when his hands could barely hold a pen. The handwriting was shaky, some words nearly illegible, but I had read it so many times I knew it by heart. "My dearest Angela," he wrote, "if you're reading this, the truth has finally come out. I only wish I could be there to see it. I'm sorry I couldn't protect you while I was alive. I was afraid of tearing the family apart, but I realize now that Diane had already torn it apart years ago. She just made sure you took all the blame. You are not the daughter who wasn't good enough. You are not the daughter who didn't try hard enough. You are not the daughter who failed. You are the daughter who was stolen from us, and that is not your shame to carry. It is theirs. Live your life now, sweetheart. Not to prove anything to anyone. Just live. because you have earned the right to be happy. I love you. I have always loved you, and wherever I am so incredibly proud of you. Forever yours, Grandpa. I folded the letter carefully and pressed it against my heart. The evening breeze carried the scent of oak leaves and fresh-cut grass, and something that smelled almost like his old cologne. For 35 years, I believed I was unworthy of my family's love. Now I understood. I was always worthy. They were the ones who failed. And I didn't need them anymore. I didn't need anyone to tell me I was enough. I already knew. Angela's story reminds us of something we often forget: the people who love us should never make us feel invisible. If your family treats you like a stranger, if they believe lies without ever asking for your side of the story, that is not your failure. That is theirs. You deserve to be heard. You deserve to be believed. And you deserve relationships where your voice matters. Sometimes the hardest thing we can do is set boundaries with the people who raised us. But boundaries are not punishment. They are protection. They teach others how to treat us. And they remind us that our peace is worth fighting for. You do not owe anyone unlimited access to your life, especially not those who have used that access to hurt you. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you of your own journey or someone you love, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. We would love to hear from you in the comments below. Have you ever had to set boundaries with family? Have you ever discovered a truth that changed everything you believed? Share your experience with us. Your story matters, and you are not alone.